Now that we've taken a brief look at a lot of the visualization options SOLIDWORKS has to offer, let's take it one step further and let's talk about renders. Now, SOLIDWORKS has added something called Render Region, which is a really cool option that you can now use to do a final render on a small portion of your design. This allows you to do things like tweak lights, tweak the scene, tweak materials, and not have to waste the time doing a full high quality render of the entire part. You can simply focus on a certain region. When we turn this on, we have a dialog box that we simply need to move around and figure out an area that we want to render. So we can move this pink box around, and whenever it's on and you go to do a final render, it'll only render what's in this area. Now, before we do something like that, let's talk a little bit about options we have when talking about final render. So on the Render Tools tab, let's go to Options. Now inside here, just like a lot of the other areas, we have a dynamic help, and it's highly recommended that you use that if there are any questions about what you're manipulating. The first section deals with the size of the final render. You have a lot of standard sizes. 16 by 9 at 1920 by 1080 is going to be the most common high definition size. As we scroll down, you notice that you can choose the image format. PNG is typically what I export, but you can choose any number of file formats. You'll notice that there's quite a bit here to choose from. So go down, you can also select a default path, but when you render it, you have the option to save it out anyways. As we keep going down a little bit, you notice that we have some custom render settings: number of reflections, refractions, and a gamma number. By default, the 1515.1 values are going to be good for most renders. You really don't need to tweak these values unless you're getting into very specific territory. And as a new user, new to SOLIDWORKS, new to CAD, you probably are just going to want to leave these alone. As we go down a little bit further, we have Bloom. Now, Bloom is a very handy option, and it really determines how things reflect off of the body. Now, it's a good idea when you turn on Dynamic Help to scroll down and look at the little options or the little graphics they give you to the right-hand side. So you can see if you slide this bar all the way up, gives the appearance of something that is really bright and emitting light. And you'll notice that bloom extents determine how far away that it goes from the object. Before I get into contour and cartoon render, I want to talk about direct caustics as well. Direct caustics are very handy when you're dealing with metallic parts and their reflections, or even transparent translucent parts. So you'll notice from the little graphic on there that the value for the caustic amount will determine how the reflection is handled off of your part onto the ground or onto other objects. And you'll notice here that we have a caustic's quality. The lower this value is, the more sparse the reflection or the light bouncing off of it is going to be. The higher the value, the more realistic, the smoother that's going to be. This is really a way that you can control the roughness of the surface of your model. Now, you do have some roughness options when you're applying the appearance to your model, but this will also take it the next step. If you have something that's supposed to be a very bumpy material, but the caustics look very smooth, probably is not going to be very realistic. So you might have to come around and tweak these things. And this is where render region comes in very handy. At the bottom, we have a network rendering option. Now, if you're on a network, if you're in an area where you can access other computers, you can have your IT professional or yourself install the network rendering client on those machines. That allows you to do things like pull resources from their systems, such as multiple cores that aren't used. So if you're doing these renders at night, if you have big renders, and you have 6 computers at your disposal that are just sitting idle, you can actually grab resources from those and make your renders happen a lot quicker. The contour and cartoon rendering. This cartoon rendering is a new option that's been added, and it gives you some different ways to visualize your model. You have just a line, you have render the cartoon shading, and then you have cartoon shading with the lines. You can modify the line colors. Let's go ahead and make the lines black, and then look at just the cartoon option. You can see this gives you a pretty cool output. If instead you go to contour, a very similar option, but it gives you just some differences here. You have just the line or the line with the render. Now the difference between contour and cartoon is this render, the render contour solid model, is going to be the full high quality render that you do, and then it's going to apply the lines to it. So this can still take a good bit of time. The cartoon render doesn't take nearly as much time, and you can see from the preview that depending on your product, that might be a pretty cool way that you can visualize it. For us, we're going to turn that option off. I'm going to go all the way back up to the top and take one last look at our settings. The last thing I want to talk about in here is render quality. Now, the preview render quality is specifically for the preview window. You can set this pretty low, and you notice it was set to good, which is the lowest option we had. And all those renders, the preview renders that we did, looked pretty good. I mean, they looked really nice, really high quality, and give us a good idea of what we were doing. If we go to maximum, the preview is going to take more time, but the quality of it's going to be a little bit higher. It still won't take as much time as the final render, so it might be a good option if you have a very big labor intensive render. Things that tend to take a lot of time when you're rendering are reflected materials, things like chrome or very highly polished metals. Those take a lot of time because it has to calculate the light bouncing off of those, especially things like the brake rotors in here. It's reflective and it has a bunch of holes, bunch of facets on it. That really can eat up the processing power. These are nice because they're inside of the wheel. It helps, but if you have light shining at it, it takes a good bit of time. Other things that take time, when you turn bloom and direct caustics on, those add time to the rendering. Those things take time to process. Other things are lights, and if you have those lights turned on and you're using shadows and you're using fog, if you're using a spotlight, those take a lot of time to process as well. So keep that in mind when you're turning these options on. If you're just trying to get a quick output, turn bloom off, turn direct caustics off, reduce the quality of your final render, and it can really make a difference at how fast these go. Once you get everything set up, your views are saved, your camera's saved, all your materials are right, then you can push it through for that final render. There is also one more very cool thing that you can do. Once you have all that set up, you have all your render quality settings set up, you can schedule the render. Now, when you schedule a render, you determine where you want to save the file, you determine when the task is going to start, you can pick a time, and there's some additional settings. When you go into settings, it'll tell you things like what you had your render quality set at. Now you cannot manipulate these things in here, but it just shows you what you have them set. So that way, before you actually save this out to be rendered at a certain time, you can cancel the job, go back into your options and manipulate things like the render quality. Now, when you do this, you have to have the SOLIDWORKS task scheduler open, which means that you have to go to your start window. You have to go all the way and manipulate down to SOLIDWORKS 2016 into tools, and then you need to open up your SOLIDWORKS task scheduler. Now inside here, once we schedule a render, it's going to show up in this window. So let's go ahead and do that. Schedule a render, and I'm going to pick it for 10 o'clock, say finish. Now if I open up the task scheduler and we refresh it, we now have a process that's waiting in here for 10:26 p.m. to start the render process. Now, if we add more renders, for instance, let's say that we wanted to go to view 2 and add this render, we can schedule it. Now we have the option to start after previous task, say finish, and then it's going to place it in the task scheduler after the previous operation. So that way you don't have to guess how long the render is going to take. It'll simply start it once the first one's finished. But let's take a look at actually doing a final render. When we go back to final render, it's going to open up the preview window. It's going to do a first pass, and then it'll open up the actual render window. Now, in the series that we did on renders and visualization, we talked a little bit more about the rendering environment. I'm going to let that crank in the background for a second. But we talked a little bit more about the rendering environment, about PhotoView 360, and some of the options that you have. You have some pre and post processing options. Now, when this thing is rendering, you can see that there's an image process window here. We can go into advanced image processing. We could do things like manipulate the bloom. Now, there's nothing to do here now because it's still rendering. Then there's also some compare options. There's statistics on how long everything's taking, the number of surfaces and segments and nodes and so on. But a lot of cool options that you can do inside here, and you really just need to come in here and play around with it. If you don't want to get the other series on renders and visualizations, you just want to play around with it, just dive in, start tweaking it, save out multiple versions of the same render, and then just play around and see what you can do. There are a lot of settings in here, and you really need to have a very good understanding of what each of those does before you start tweaking it. But you're not going to be hurting the original file, you're going to be saving a different version of it. So go crazy, see what you can do, and see how it helps you. Now, you'll notice what's happening on the screen as this is rendering. First off, it's zoomed out at 25%, so it's not rendering this small, it's actually a pretty large image. We're just zoomed out so we can see the whole thing. The little boxes that are going around are rendering small sections of everything. Now it does multiple passes. It goes over it once, goes over it twice, goes over it a third time, and then it does some of the post-processing after the fact. Sometimes if you're doing the bloom and the direct caustics, I don't know if you noticed, but right at the end, the rims, the highlights on the rims, those really came into their own. And that's because a lot of the stuff happens post-process. The bloom, for instance, you can turn it on and off now, and you can see the difference it makes on the model. We can adjust these, such as go to 150%. The bloom extent, we can take that out to 25%. The bloom set point, we can take it down to 50. We can adjust all these settings on the fly and see how it adjusts the model itself. We can also do things like manipulate the channels, move different options around, and so on. So, definitely a good idea for you to go in and you to play with the different options you have, play with the things that you can do, and just go crazy. You're not going to hurt anything. Play with this model, play with any models you create, and see how far you can get without any instruction. And I really find that that is the best way, seeing somebody do it and then playing around with it and figuring out how you can make it your own.